Hi, welcome everybody to today's webinar with ISE Chief Research Officer Tristram Hooley. My name is Marina. I will be facilitating the webinar. I will shortly hand over to Tristram, who will be updating you on the latest coronavirus data and policy. Last week we had an incredibly engaged webinar on this topic, so the webinar will consist of a short presentation followed by a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please type them in the question box and we will go through them at the end of the presentation. That's it from me. All yours, Tristram.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. So what I'm going to be doing is trying to just do a kind of fairly quick run through of all of the different things that I've spotted over the last couple of weeks that relate to the coronavirus, to COVID-19, and to student recruitment. So this is drawn from various materials that are on our website. So just wanted to highlight kind of three things. The first thing is that we've just created this new area of our website, which is coronavirus updates, and a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is drawn from those. But essentially each week we're putting out a sort of short list of bullet points of kind of everything that you need to know that's happened over the last week. So we've actually just added bulletin 3. So if you go onto the ISE news page, then you'll find it there. We've also published a couple of papers, so many of you probably will have already heard our research that we did a couple of weeks ago, which looked at how employers were responding to COVID-19. I'm going to present, a couple of little bits from that today as well. But also earlier in the week, we published an employer's guide to COVID-19, which really is trying to kind of, I suppose, look at some of the more strategic issues about how you might go about actually responding to COVID-19 as a student employer. And so that's available for members to download, and there are also webinars and so on that accompany all of these things. So, but yeah, there's lots of stuff on our website right at the moment that might be of interest to you. This is what I'm going to try and cover today. So I'm going to start by looking a little bit at the progress of the disease itself. We're going to look at politics, policy and government, education and the economy, the labour market more generally, and then zero in on student recruitment and development. And I'm going to finish by doing a kind of summary of some of the insights that we've been getting from the conversations we've been having with employers over the last few weeks. And so these are really drawn mainly from our town halls, which are a series of virtual sector-based meetings that we're having with employers. And so we're really learning a lot about what employers are doing, and I'm going to kind of go through some of that. And let's start with COVID-19. Now, you will have seen lots of charts like this over the last few weeks, but this is the kind of progress of the outbreak since we released our research. And what we can see is that it's really steady upward movement of the number of cases and the number of deaths. So while there is some evidence of a global slowdown, that the coronavirus is progressing through the world slightly slower, it is still presenting a real and ongoing threat in the UK. And I think we would say, and I mean, obviously I'm not in the government, and so they may well make a different decision, but it seems to me that the curve is still not flattening convincingly enough to justify the end of the lockdown. So that's where we are. So let's look at how politics have dealt with this. So the key kind of political events, I think, that have happened over the last couple of weeks really have been that national lockdown is now in place. It's likely to be extended beyond the original 3 weeks, and it may even have to be tightened. So there are various conversations about that. Parliament has moved into recess. And there's not a clear idea about when Parliament will begin to meet again, whether it will meet virtually and so on. There are various discussions going on. Matthew Hancock, the Health Secretary, conceded earlier this week, or maybe at the end of last week, that a number of mistakes have been made, and he was looking at adjusting the strategy a little bit. But one area where the government has now done quite a lot is to introduce quite a variety of employment support measures, which I'll say a little bit more about later on. Obviously, and sadly, the Prime Minister is in intensive care at the moment, and so Dominic Raab is currently in charge. It's not clear how long that's going to make. My sense is that probably won't make a very big difference to how the government handles the crisis, but we'll have to see. On the Labour side, we've seen the new Labour leader Keir Starmer elected. He's promised scrutiny and constructive engagement with the government, and he's also made a number of key appointments. So the shadow cabinet is now in place with Rebecca Long-Bailey as the Education Secretary and Ed Miliband as the Business Secretary. So they're probably the key ones for our area. And opinion polling suggests that while people are pretty concerned about COVID-19, 70%, so the overwhelming majority of people really believe that the government is doing a good job. Now, obviously, opinion polls can swing. This opinion poll comes from before the numbers really started to climb. So the numbers of deaths yesterday was as high, well, it was the highest it's ever been, and I think it was higher than it ever got in Italy. So it may well be that there are some things that are going to happen over the next few weeks that are going to shake that, but at least by the end of last week, the population were broadly supportive of the approach the government were taking. So if we look at what's happening in education, so schools, let's start with schools. All schools and colleges have closed, except for the children of key workers and vulnerable children. GCSEs and A-levels have been cancelled. The examinations, at least, have been cancelled. And Ofqual has now announced the arrangements for the awarding of the GCSEs and the A-levels. So schools and colleges are going to be asked to provide data, which are going to be based largely on teacher judgments on which qualifications and grades should be awarded. Now, schools won't know exactly what grades they're going to be awarding because they will make judgments, but they will also be providing other data which will allow Ofqual to provide context to that data. And so the qualifications that will be awarded should be awarded on the usual timetable and should essentially be the same as the qualifications that are normally awarded. However, there's some research that's come out from HEPI and Youth Site which suggests that many young people are quite skeptical about this. They don't really trust their predicted grades. They fear that this will impact on the qualifications. And so there's some areas of concern, and that may lead to more, I think we would expect that there would be more contestation of the results that people get. So people might be complaining, this is not a fair grade, and so on. And so that process might take a bit longer, but in theory, the GCSE and A-level approach should happen on the same sort of basis. Now, I've just heard, just before I went on, I just read something saying that BTECs will also follow a similar kind of process. So if you're employing students with BTECs, that's also going to work in a similar way. Finally, school performance tables are cancelled for the year. So obviously lots of the data in which schools are judged is not going to be available in the normal way, so those have been cancelled. If we move on to apprenticeships, the government has confirmed the apprenticeship funding will continue and has published guidance for employers, providers and assessors. If you want that guidance, you can go through to our COVID-19 bulletins and you can get the link through from there. We also see, but we've seen a number of problems emerging in terms of funding. And so the representative body for independent training providers, the Association of Employment and Learning Providers, say that the financial problems caused by COVID-19 are leaving many apprenticeship providers on the brink of collapse. And I've certainly been hearing this from a number of contacts that I've got, that there are some serious problems here. So that may create some problems for employers in terms of taking on apprenticeships. If we now look at universities, most universities, or in fact all universities, have now ceased face-to-face teaching. They're developing alternative examination processes for this year. Some are still announcing those. The government is considering introducing number controls on universities' recruitment of students next year to try and create more stability over the next academic year. And also the AGCAS conference has been cancelled. So there are a number of things happening in universities as well. All of these things potentially matter for how student recruitment operates. I'm not going to say a lot about the economy. There's been a lot written about it already. Just this rather depressing picture from The Economist yesterday says COVID-19 causes Britain's fastest economic contraction on record. A number of countries have reported very severe economic problems, including France, which has announced that it's gone into recession. The question, I think, has really moved on from whether we can escape recession, because I think recession is pretty much understood to be a given now. The question is, what shape will that be? Will it be a V shape? So as we went into recession very quickly, we hope that we will come out of recession very quickly. Increasingly, I think people are saying that seems unlikely. It may be U-shaped, so we may spend a period in recession before we start to come out. A nice metaphor I heard this morning was the idea of the wheelbarrow-shaped recession. So, and I think that's probably quite accurate. So we have the idea that we have had a very rapid drop into recession. We will then spend a period of time in recession and then slowly climb out. How long all of those things take and how deep that recession is will make a big difference for student recruitment. So let's look at how the labour market is faring. Well, I mean, I've posted various statistics and charts and things that look like this, but this is one that was pretty recent. So this is job postings on the Indeed site, and it shows that there's a massive and an unprecedented drop-off in the number of job postings that are being posted during this year as opposed to the last 2 years. So we're seeing the number of jobs in the economy at the moment, the number of jobs being advertised in the economy is much, much less than we might normally expect. And that's then echoed by this chart, which kind of goes the opposite way, which is essentially an unemployment measure. Universal credit isn't only claimed by people who are unemployed, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But for now, let's assume that this is a growth in unemployment or underemployment. What we can see is that, while we've seen a bit of growth over recent years in the level of people applying for universal credit, what we have seen over the last few weeks is just a massive, massive spike. So people are losing jobs, people are being furloughed, there are not very many new jobs in the economy, and many, many people are now claiming universal credit and are becoming unemployed. So that gives us a bit of context for what's happening in the specific area of student recruitment and development. So in our research that we published a couple of weeks ago, we noted that there was a shift going on in recruitment approaches. Many things were being cancelled, but also importantly, large amounts of recruitment processes were moving online. And that is still the case. I'm going to say a little bit more at the end about where we think that has got to. We also saw in that research that employers were planning some shifts in their recruitment. Many still didn't know at the point at which we did that research, and I think that is still the case. Some were continuing as planned, but there was also a substantial chunk, maybe about a quarter, who were looking to reduce the numbers. Now, one of the things that is worth noticing about this is that while many employers, while perhaps a quarter of employers are reducing their hiring, very few of them are reducing it substantially at the present time. So that's really quite good news. And I suppose what we would want is we expect employers to adjust their recruitment up and down with recession, up and down with their businesses. COVID-19 has accelerated that, so that's happening over a faster period than normal. But what we're not seeing so far is kind of complete cut and run. We're not seeing employers moving out of the student labour market altogether. So let's move on to look at some insights in terms of what we're hearing from employers that help us to update that picture that we formed a couple of weeks ago. As the lockdown has gone on, as the number of cases and deaths have got higher, what has been happening? What has been employers' responses? Well, the first thing, if we think about recruitment processes, many employers are telling us that they have successfully transferred their recruitment processes online. They're now using Zoom and similar tools for online group work and online interviews and those kinds of things. Now, on the bulletin note that I did last week, so bulletin 2, I provided a bit more detail about the kinds of things that they're doing. In the guide for employers that I mentioned earlier, we provide some more detail about how people are approaching that. For example, people are talking about doing things like having 2 recruiters available when you're running online group assessments, organizing students into groups of 6 and so on. So we're starting to get some insights into how these new practices are actually working, but there are also some big questions, as inevitably there are going to be, in a process that's been generated very quickly. And some employers have raised issues around sort of equality and diversity, and saying things like, well, the shift to digital, moving everything online, raises issues for candidates who don't have good access to digital, perhaps because they can't afford the IT infrastructure, perhaps because they live in rural areas that aren't well served, perhaps because they have their own impairments, disabilities and impairments that make using these tools more difficult. These are things that employers are aware of. They're not necessarily in a position to do very much about them now because they're just trying to kind of figure out how to manage recruitment. But these are things that are definitely going to have to be looked at in the longer run. Okay, so moving on to apprenticeships as a specific group. I've already mentioned this really in the education section of this update, but the hiring of apprentices has been disrupted by the issues that are faced by apprenticeship training providers during the crisis. Now, obviously, that's very bad for those independent training providers who are struggling financially. Some may go out of business, but it's also very bad for employers who are using those providers both often to source candidates, sometimes even to assess candidates for their apprenticeships, but then obviously to deliver their development provision. So that's also very important, I think. So issues within the education system, within the apprenticeship system, particularly related around what may be fairly short-term issues around funding, could be having a bigger knock-on effect on the effective functioning of the apprenticeship non-graduate labour market. If we then turn to look at internships and placements, most Easter placement schemes have now been cancelled. We're now into Easter, and so the ones that obviously aren't running aren't going to run. And some summer placement schemes have been cancelled as well. But in other areas, employers are seeking to adjust the way that they're running those summer placements, probably still hedging their bets a little, as we can't be sure. But some are thinking about things like shortening placements, so having students starting perhaps mid-July rather than at the end of June or whenever they might have started previously. Some are moving things online or offering some kind of alternative experience if they can't offer a full internship. It's very unclear how placement numbers in the next academic year will be affected by this. It will probably mirror to a large extent the kind of experience of the graduate offers. Employers are talking a bit about how they're managing offers. So one of the concerns, and they're kind of coming at this issue from 2 ends. So on one hand, they are aware that students are getting nervous. Many students are concerned and are looking to see whether they need to have alternative plans, a plan B, because perhaps they're worried that the offer that they've got with a particular employer may not hold up. And in that case, employers are doing their best to try and keep them warm, engage them, keep them up to date, provide good information about what the firm is doing and that kind of thing. However, there's also, on the other side of that, some employers who are seeking to maintain some flexibility with one eye on the sort of longer term impacts of the crisis. And in that case, they're seeking to maintain some flexibility by perhaps delaying the issuing of formal contracts. When we get to hiring, we can see that many employers have paused their recruitment, and sometimes this is due to sort of practical reasons. So, for example, current staff might have been furloughed. In some cases, we know that includes hiring teams. So in that case, obviously, recruitment is paused. But many are hoping to restart recruitment in June or July for September starts. Some employers, as I said earlier, have revised the graduate and apprentice numbers downwards, so we're likely to see a smaller graduate and apprentice labour market this year. And we also see that some employers are continuing to work to their existing number plans. When we then start to think about what the practical issues of starting staff are, bearing in mind in a normal year, staff might be starting work really from the end of July through into perhaps the beginning of October. Depending on the firm, they may have different dates. Some may do phased starts. That becomes problematic if we're still under lockdown or some kind of partial lockdown. So in this case, some employers are contingency planning to induct new staff virtually in September. And some have talked about how they've actually got experience of doing that with other staff in the past, but other employers remain skeptical of this and plan to delay start dates. And we've certainly heard of some employers who have delayed start dates to either later in the year or early next year. So in that case, students may find that they're graduating and have some time to fill as they're waiting to start employment. So in summary, I think it is a very strange time to be alive. None of us seen anything like this before. That's one of the reasons why the ISE is putting so much time and effort into trying to understand what is actually happening in the labour market at the moment. There are lots of reasons to be concerned about the economy and the labour market. I've tried to outline some of them here. But for now, at least, I think student recruiters seem to be reacting quite cautiously and avoiding panic. And so we're seeing numbers holding up, even if the numbers of recruits are likely to be less than last year. They're probably not, at the moment at least, going to be dramatically less. So people are not cutting and running. So that's, I think, some good news. Now, obviously, the situation is highly dynamic and we don't really know which direction it's going to go in. And so we will be looking and trying to provide regular updates. Those bulletins that we're now providing every Thursday morning will be, one of the key sources of information. We will undoubtedly have new data to present. We've got a supplier survey that we have just closed and we will hopefully be publishing next week. And so we will have more data to offer. There will be undoubtedly more webinars, and we hope to keep supporting you in all of your efforts to recruit and support students in this period. Some information about me there if you're interested in making contact, and I'd be happy to take any questions that people have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tristram. So yes, if you have any questions, please type them away in the question box in your panel on the right-hand side. If you haven't taken part in our webinars before, we record all our webinars, and the recording of this session will be available on our website by the end of the day. As Tristram mentioned, we are producing a lot of relevant content to support you. We've done a lot of webinars in the past 2-3 weeks, so we encourage you to have a look at our past webinar page on the website, and feel free to share these with your colleagues. Right, so first question from Fatima. Is the change in hiring graph an updated version from the original one, or the same as the first webinar?
No, it's the same. So this is data that we've got from the first week really of the kind of COVID-19 crisis, really before the lockdown happened. So this is the best data that we've got. It's the best data I think anyone's got on how this part of the market is operating. We will have some data from suppliers, which we'll be able to share next week. I won't go into that in detail, but broadly it sort of shows a fairly similar pattern. So suppliers are obviously not making the hires themselves, but they are interfacing with a lot of different employers, and their kind of confidence about the labour market is quite similar. That essentially we will see a decline, but in most cases that decline is not going to be very large, or at least at the moment it's not. We are thinking about doing another one of these surveys to update it. So I'm going to start thinking about that after Easter. If people have got particular questions or issues that they would like us to explore through any new research that we do with employers, then please do send them over.
Thank you. Helen asks, just a second. Helen asks, how could I find out more information about virtual internships and how they are run?
Yeah, so I think we will be presenting some more information on the website. We're looking for suppliers who have more information about that. Some suppliers are definitely offering that as a way of supporting students. What we're seeing in that kind of virtual internship space is there's quite a variety of different sorts of approaches that people are taking. So at one end, you've got firms who are really trying to run a full internship but just do it online. Just as most of us are now working remotely, they will bring staff in, they will induct staff in some way, they will then give them some projects to work on and manage them as they would normally do, but it will just all be done virtually. At the other end, we've got things which are really more of a kind of an experience or a connection, perhaps a mentoring scheme and that kind of thing. And then there are various kinds of options in between. But yeah, I think if you come on the ISE website, I think you'll see more, and we'll look at trying to get some suppliers to present some information about how that can be organised in the near future.
Monica asks, what advice would you give to finalists completing their studies now?
Yeah, so it's quite difficult, I think, for finalists. So I linked in the last set of guidance, last set of bulletins, so bulletin 2, I linked to an article that discussed this and made some recommendations. But I think essentially finalists are going to have to try and deal with the next few months as positively as possible. They're going to have to try and continue to preserve their employability, to make sure that they get their qualifications and so on. I think that it may be possible that the opportunities for work are less, and probably employers will feel positively about people who were able to spend time doing some purposeful activity. So there may be, and this is not just immediately in the COVID-19 crisis. As I said earlier, a number of employers are potentially delaying their start date. So it may be that we come out of lockdown, but your start date has been pushed back to October, November, even January. It's a good idea to spend some time, trying to do things like volunteering and so on to fill your time purposefully. If you don't have a job, I think it's absolutely important to carry on applying. Of course, the labour market is very strange at the moment. Of course, it is very difficult, but that does not mean that there will be no jobs for graduates or there will be no jobs for students leaving education. And really, you don't have a lot of choice. I think it's also important for you to think about your plan B and to find out a bit about how you might go about claiming benefits and so on. So I think there's probably quite a few different approaches that people who are about to leave education might want to take as they think about their futures.
Thank you. A follow-up question from Monica. What industries should finalists approach to look for graduate jobs?
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit in the webinar last week. It's not completely clear how this is going to play out on a sectoral level yet. I think there are obviously some sectors where we're seeing particularly heavy impact. So a lot of the kind of entertainment industry, travel, certain aspects of retail are being hit very hard at the moment. How that plays through into more sort of secondary elements of the labour market, so into, say, like the big consultancies who are unlikely to kind of immediately turn down their numbers, but who may see in the long run that their business is affected is not clear. What we can say is that some sectors, digital and so on, seem to be holding up relatively well. But yeah, I mean, we will have more to say on this. What we can definitely say is that in pretty much all areas, we have seen a drop in job opportunities. So at the moment, it's not clear how the sectoral pattern is going to play out, really.
Thank you. Victoria asks, are you aware of any employer who have decided to cancel their summer placements? Are they offering compensation packages? And if so, what does it look like?
Yeah, so I'm not a legal expert, so I don't know what they have to do. What I've heard is, yes, some employers are cancelling summer placements. In some cases, and it will depend on the contracts that they've agreed with people, they are offering some kind of essentially severance pay, so a week or whatever it's worth of pay as part of that. Probably more importantly, many of them are also offering some other kind of experience for students that gives them the opportunity to this kind of virtual internship that we were already talking about. But yeah, so it's definitely some employers are doing that. I don't have information to say that all employers are doing that. I suspect many will not be doing that, and it will depend a bit on the kind of contracts that people have signed.
Thank you. Martin asks, any thoughts on how the crisis will impact on student recruitment to university in September, October 2020?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of scenarios. So one, and I think this is important both for undergraduate numbers and also for postgraduate numbers, which has a wider impact on the graduate labour market, is if universities are up and running and in a position to start teaching in September, I think there's a very good chance that they will see an uplift in numbers, that anybody who can go to university or take a postgraduate course will think about doing it. And that's because if you were looking at the labour market now, you would think this is a pretty risky time to enter the labour market. And maybe if you can have another year or another 3 years in education, it would be a good time to do it. So I think that's probably the most likely scenario, is that we see increased demand for education. But there is another possibility, which is that universities are not quite ready to accept students in September, and that they communicate to students telling them that they are going to have to either delay the start of term, or they're going to have to offer the first term as an online course or whatever. My guess, and I don't have really strong evidence for this, but my guess is that that will have an impact on students, and many students may defer their place for a year. So I think it really depends on how the crisis moves. But I think there are, in general, economic downturns are good for education, good for non-compulsory education. But there may be some specific things here that make it a bit more difficult this year.
Right, thank you. Jenny says, thank you, Tristram. Apart from the career service and ISE, can you share any other resources we can share with students and grads around current UK and global employability?
Yeah, I mean, if you go through our bulletins, we're trying to pull everything together that we can find. There's data on kind of wider labour market, the specific things on the student labour market. There's quite a lot of resources there. We do have, if we look on our kind of equivalent organisation in Australia, they've been doing a similar set of surveys to us, so there is some information that's international. We haven't got very strong international information about kind of global hiring patterns. What I did see was an International Labour Organization report that was done probably around about the same time as our report was, so towards the beginning of this particular crisis. And they were predicting a very substantial increase in unemployment, and they were modelling it as somewhere between 5 million and 36 million increased unemployed people in the global economy. So obviously that will vary as we move from country to country. But yeah, this is very much a global situation. So many of the things that are happening in the UK will also be happening elsewhere.
Thank you. Vicky asks, I remember reading that following the 2008 recession, graduate employers went back to recruiting from what they knew Russell Group unions. Do you think we might see a similar thing? How can we ensure we keep diversity and inclusivity on the agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a very, I mean, I don't know the specifics of the study that she's talking about, but I think it seems right to me that in these situations, when there's a kind of big shock, that it tends to be the more disadvantaged, the more vulnerable people usually bear the brunt of it more so than everyone else. I mean, there was actually, I don't know whether people saw, but there was a kind of piece that's been circulating around social media from Emily Maitlis on the news last night, where she made this exact point that although there is a sense, of course, that everybody's in it together, that the effects of the crisis are being felt more by kind of, you know, poor, disadvantaged, vulnerable young people and so on. I think that's very much the case. I think at the moment it's very difficult for us to really keep diversity and inclusion as a strong theme in discussion, because employers are struggling so much just to kind of manage the basics of their recruitment. I think that will reassert. People are already talking about it, and we do need to really make a strong effort to try and make sure that this kind of shift, this kind of downturn, doesn't just result in, you know, returns to kind of very poor practice in terms of recruiting, you know, just the most advantaged people in society.
Thank you. Tristram, you've been attending and delivering sector-specific webinars. So Katie is wondering, is it possible to provide a webinar on the health sector?
Yeah, we don't. I mean, the way we divide our sectors up, we don't really have one that's directly health, partly because health kind of crosses across a number of things. So obviously you've got people who are in pharmaceuticals, which you know, we might deal with perhaps within the kind of industrial sector that we have, and then you've got people who are in public sector, so National Health Service or whatever. I think it's an interesting question. We can certainly have a think about that. We don't have specific data on health. What we do know is that, you know, obviously and unsurprisingly, you know, one of the few jobs that is increasing is various forms of health worker. I mean, that is one of the things that if the National Health Service could get hold of more nurses, more doctors and so on, they absolutely would do that at the moment. And, you know, I think we could probably make an educated guess that over the longer run, there is going to be substantial investment in pharmaceutical research and so on. So I think there are some good indications that the issue of health might be an important theme going forward in the economy. We don't have any specific data on health as a sector as such.
Liz asks, do you have any information from universities on the timeline for degree results to come out?
No, I mean, I think the plan will be that that things come out in the similar sort of timescale as usual. I mean, that's what the A levels are going to do. It's what the GCSEs are going to do. I think universities will be aiming for that. I think whether they can pull that off and achieve that will vary. And one of the things to be sure is that universities don't have to all operate together in the way that the GCSEs do. So I think it's very likely that some universities are able to award degrees on a roughly similar timetable. So by, you know, so let's say by the end of July, that they have a pretty good idea of who's getting what classification. Others it may take longer, and we'll have to wait and see how that goes. I think it's pretty unlikely that if we're thinking about new staff starting, I think it's pretty unlikely that universities have not figured out how to award people degree classifications by the beginning of September. So I think on that level, employers can probably feel confident that they'll be able to offer jobs and have people who receive those qualifications. Having said that, you might want to think about how much stock you put on the qualification grade or the grade. I mean, we already have got a very live discussion in the industry about how important the grades are, whether it's really important to only employ people who have 2 1s or whether that really matters or not. I think this year it's going to be, it's going to be much less clear that that is a really important distinguishing factor for people. So you might want to be a bit more open in your recruitment practice this year.
Thank you. Helen asks, we are planning career fairs to start in October and early November. Do you think the same number of employers will attend career fairs in autumn, or do you think this number is likely to be reduced?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, it will depend. It will depend on probably 3 things. It will depend on what the government's position on lockdown is. It may be, for example, that the lockdown has been opened up, but that large events such as careers fairs are still not encouraged. I mean, that's one possibility. There's also obviously going to be a set of institutional and organisational policies about which may take a while for some employers to make the decision that this is the kind of thing they want to be involved in. And then there's the wider economic thing, which is really how hard are people recruiting in that period. So I don't think it's very easy to predict. I think there's certainly quite a lot of risk that I would flag if I was organising a big event in October, say.
This question from Martin might be our last question, but if anyone has any queries, please type your questions away in the question box. But in the meantime, Martin, a follow-up question from Martin. What about student recruitment from Europe and the rest of the world?
Yeah, I mean, it seems pretty difficult to imagine that this will help that. I think Brexit is already making those kinds of things more complicated. I think with what we've seen over the last few months, the number of employers and the number of people who are going to be wanting to bring people across borders to work in jobs is probably going to reduce. I mean, a lot of this will depend on how government goes. It will also depend on when we get back to Brexit negotiations, which is not at all clear to me as to whether we will still be working on the original timetable of leaving the European Union by the end of the year, or whether they will look for some sort of extension.
Thank you. Question from Corinne. Given that many employers are engaging in more online recruitment activities, have any of them expressed an interest in things like virtual career fairs, webinars, and virtual mock assessment centres as the main form of their engagement in the autumn?
I think it's definitely in the air. I think people's first, because of when this happened in the year, we were largely past the period when people were doing a lot of attraction and more into the period where people were at the sort of tail end often of their selection processes. What we've definitely seen is that people are interested in moving stuff online. When we asked the questions, which seems like a long while ago, but in fact it was only a couple of weeks ago, we asked that mainly people say no, we're going to cancel them rather than shift them online. But my sense is that if we're looking forward to the next academic year, that proportion who are moving stuff online of those kinds of things that you're talking about will increase probably quite substantially.
Great, thank you, Tristram. I think that's all the questions. Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Again, thank you, Tristram. And once again, this webinar should be available on our website by the end of the day. That's it. Have a lovely long weekend and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.